Good morning and welcome to the Point. We're talking with some of our state legislators again this morning. The State House is off for a couple of weeks, but there's a lot to be done, and we talked with Democratic Representative Terry Sabo. He's from Muskegon. He's very interested in what's going on with the Great Lakes Restoration Initiative and also has some positive things to say about his hometown. Representative, let's talk about some of the things that you've worked on in the first quarter. By the time this airs, we will have had 3 months more or less that have gone by. It's been an interesting time in Lansing, maybe not quite as headline grabbing as what's going on in Washington. But one of the things I know that you've been working on is a resolution that ties into what's going on in Washington. Being from Muskegon as you are, Great Lakes are a big deal. Not that they aren't to all of us. And the Great Lakes Restoration Initiative is something that the president cut from his budget recommendations. Now, I should point out, as I have in the past, it is not the president who decides where the money gets spent, and there is a large coalition of congressional leaders from all those Great Lakes states and beyond who very likely will get some of that money put back in. But you wanted to make sure that they had a sense of what people in the Michigan House were thinking.
Yeah, absolutely. You know, that is so important to the Great Lakes and specifically in Muskegon, in my opinion, because it just affects so many different walks of life, from the recreational boating to the restoration efforts of the various lakes. You know, specifically in Muskegon, we have Muskegon Lake, we have the White Lake. Both are on the list of contamination, and we need to get those off. Now, White Lake has already come off, but Muskegon Lake was next in line, and we need to do that. We need to continue the funding for it. It's really unprecedented, the type of cooperation that we have throughout the Great Lakes in making sure that some of these waters are kept clean and have been cleaned up.
This was really modeled after a plan to restore the Everglades after they had become in pretty bad shape down there, and it's remarkable how it worked. So this isn't just lakes, but you're talking about inland lakes that can flow into, or the runoff waters and contaminants can get into the Great Lakes, which has a lot to do with commerce, has a lot to do not with just shipping, but fishing and recreation, all of those things that we depend on here in the state. So what was the sense? So you passed a resolution.
Yes, well, we introduced a resolution.
And
I'll tell you, when I was working my way around the House floor, talking to people on both sides of the aisle, there was a lot of consensus in that, you know, we got to have this funding reinstated. It's just too important to Michigan and too important to the Great Lakes to let this go.
This is about $300 million, and as I made the point on a previous show, in the federal budget, that's a rounding error. On the other hand, there are dozens, hundreds, thousands perhaps of $300 million projects that if you are going to at some point rein in the spending of the federal government, you have to look at all of those programs. What is your sense? I don't know if you've had a chance to talk to any of the federally elected folks, but I think all of them in the state have expressed their concerns about that cut. Do you feel like that it becomes a bipartisan issue and that people are going to push back?
Yeah, I really believe it is a bipartisan issue because you know, it's something that's just so important, and so many people realize the significant effect of what this could be if that funding is cut. Now, I have not had an opportunity to talk to anybody from the federal level, but certainly what I'm seeing out there in the media and what they're saying in the media is that we are all on the same page, that this is just too important to let go.
I was going to say this till the end of this segment. Let's talk about it now, because this directly ties into Great Lakes and what's going on in Muskegon. You started when you were running saying, look, I'm going to look out for Muskegon. I want things to get better in Muskegon. I'm going to continue the progress that's already started. And the first thing you said before we sat down, when I said, so what do you got going on? You said there's some good things going on in Muskegon. So let's talk about it.
Yeah, Muskegon's really on the rebound, I believe. There's a lot of good things happening, specifically right around the port of Muskegon. With the recent transaction of the Consumers Energy property, or at least the movement towards that, I'm looking for some big things there to be happening to get that property cleaned up and ready for development, but also on the Sappi property on the other end of Muskegon Lake. There's a lot of things happening there with the Pure Muskegon group and all the things that they have going on. The DEQ recently issued a $1 million grant to take those stacks down that we have on that Sappi property, which I think is a big deal. And the reason I say that is because, you know, my predecessor worked very hard to make sure that those stacks were brought down in an environmentally safe way, so that we're not endangering the community when that happens. And I'm thankful that we have funds available at the state level to make that happen, and we're going to see that through.
When all of that is done, when the remediation or whatever has to be done out there, is that then land that you see being developed for more recreational or more industrial use?
Well, I think the Pure Muskegon Group has recreational in mind, and I'm really excited about what's happening there. I think that's a big deal for Muskegon and really for the whole region here in West Michigan.
I think one of the things people may not immediately think about is that port up there, because it is one with more capacity than many around the Great Lakes, even though we don't talk about it a lot.
Yes, that's correct. It's the only natural deep water port on the entire west side of Michigan. And I'm really excited about what potentially could be happening there. And we'll have to see. We'll have to see if the business world really wants to embrace the marine world and transportation that we have available there.
In switching gears a little bit, another issue that I know has been of concern to you and impacts people in your district, and that's the unemployment insurance problems that have been experienced here in the state. We've heard from others that they're really concerned about that. But let's talk a little bit first of all, about some of the problems. People were receiving unemployment benefits, then they were told after a computer did a computer check, said you're not eligible for those benefits. They were ordered to pay them back, and then we found that many of them were in fact eligible. So how has that impacted?
Yeah, that was not a good situation. I really think that's a type of situation in Michigan that we should be hanging our heads on, because we had a lot of people affected by that were wrongly accused of fraud in the unemployment agency, and at a time when they really need the help, and then now they get turned around and be told that they're in a fraud situation is not good. Just in Muskegon alone, I mean, we had several people affected. One person that I know of was affected in the sense that while he was legally living here, he was from another country, and he was on the verge of being deported because of this fraud allegation that he did not do, and it had devastating effects, and we've got to fix it.
Well, what is the fix? How do you go about that?
Well, there's several different bills that are going to be coming out that involve that. And one of them is, trying to take a better look at how this fraud is determined. But really, on the bigger scale, I think we have to get back to some of the things that Michigan was a part of before, and extending those benefits, making sure that people are being compensated appropriately, and trying to fix those areas that we had the problems with when this fraud allegations came out.
On the other side of the coin, and this isn't anything we really talked about, but it dawns on me, particularly from your area, that there was a time when we had such high unemployment and there was so much demand on that system. Mm-hmm. We're now at a time when people appear to be really looking for employees. I know in the Muskegon area there's a big job fair up there, and in the years that it's been operating, it's gone from workers looking for jobs to employers looking for workers. Mm-hmm. What's your sense of where you are economically with people looking for work in your district?
Well, when I talk to industry in my area, that's one of the common things that I hear is finding qualified workers. That is a big problem, and it's something that we have to do a better job of getting people trained in some of those skilled areas so that they are employable. And I think that we do have some initiatives in Muskegon that are happening that are going to address that, and I look forward to seeing that pan out, because bottom line is we want to keep our workers home, working for our businesses at home.
The governor has said for a number of years that more skilled trades training needs to take place. It needs to be integrated into high school, community college, and those kind of places, and put some money in the budget for it. Is that an initiative that you would support?
Absolutely. It's I think one of the problems that we have nowadays are we're lacking some of those shop classes that we used to have in high school, and a lot of people are not exposed to that anymore. A lot of students are not exposed to it. While college is very important to get that college education, there's some other careers out there that are just as important, as far as our electrical workers and plumbers. We need people who can do those types of jobs, and they're very good paying jobs if they have the proper training.
And some of those don't require 4 years. I mean, you might be able to be trained in 18 months, 24 months, something like that, for the student who wants to get in the workforce more quickly.
Yes, that's correct.
Let's talk a little bit about something that I know the House passed, I think 108-0.
Yes.
A series of bills, 9 or 10 of them, dealing with transparency, including expanding the Freedom of Information Act, so it would include you. Yes. Members of the House, members of the Senate, the governor's office, and others. Tell me about that initiative, because reporters like me spend a lot of time talking about why guys like you and Republicans can't get together on things. So here are some bills that passed unanimously. You ought to at least get some credit for that bipartisan effort.
Well, Rick, I'll tell you, I've been involved in government my whole career. From the military to working in local government as an employee, working on the administrative side of government. I've always been subject to FOIA requests, to having my information out there for anyone who wants to know about it. And I was so surprised that when I got to the House of Representatives, I was no longer under FOIA. And I just find that terrible. In Michigan, we're one of the least transparent states in the entire country, and that is something that we need to change. We've got to make sure that people know what we're doing at all times, and not just while we're on the House floor, but they need to know all of our dealings that we have going on.
What would that entail? Because as a reporter, I want everything. But there have to be some parameters. For example, let's say I'm your constituent and I'm having a problem, let's say with the unemployment folks.
Yeah.
And so I have to give you information about my background, maybe social security number, those kind of things. Obviously, you have to protect that stuff somehow.
Well, I look at it just the way the FOIA laws are set up now. I am perfectly content with being applied to those laws as a state legislator. I think we all should be. And I have no problem with the way those laws are written at this point.
So you think there are adequate protections in the law the way it's written?
I believe so, yes.
Up next, a Republican perspective, including what happened to that vote to reduce the income tax. That's next. To the Point. Welcome back to The Point. This morning we're talking with members of the State House of Representatives, including Republican Chris Afendoulis from Grand Rapids Township. We talked to him about one of the first votes in the chamber this year. It was a Republican initiative to roll back the income tax, but Afendoulis was one of 12 Republicans who said no. Let's talk a little bit about some of the first steps out of the gate in this legislature. Obviously, there was much made about a vote on taxes that ended up failing. You voted against that measure. We'll get to that in a minute. But I want to talk about the process. Normally, in leadership, you introduce something when you have the votes, or you have the votes and you put it together. What's going on in the Republican caucus? I mean, I know you can't talk about what happens in the caucus room, but I mean, obviously that vote didn't turn out the way leadership would have wanted.
I think there's certainly a fundamental difference. On some people believe fiscal conservatism means paying off your debts and taking care of the commitments you've made. Vis-a-vis road funding is a great example. By 2020, we're going to be spending $600 million of general fund money on roads. We made a commitment in the roads package to do that, to use current revenues, so we wouldn't have to raise the gas tax as much. I looked at that and I said, well, that's a commitment I've made, and now people are advocating to strip the revenue that will support that. So I think people that voted against it had a fundamental problem with, we've really got some big fiscal issues. We've got the retirement liabilities, OPEB, and the MIPSR system that are underfunded. Those have to be taken care of. We've got to meet the commitment for our roads. And there's a huge question mark relative to Medicaid and what's going to happen. I know that the health care bill failed as we saw it recently. However, we are not sure what's going to come back and what we're going to see on that. So to me, there was just too much fiscal risk and too much uncertainty. But back to your question about, okay, you put something up for it to pass, typically, and I think maybe the speaker thought he had the votes for it to pass. However, there was a segment of our caucus that just wanted to go on record and take a vote, even if it put some people possibly in a bad position. But I was very comfortable with my vote. I was always prepared to vote no on that because I really believe down deep we've got to come up with some structural cuts in the budget and structural adjustments. Because even if we don't do anything, Rick, by 2019 we're going to have an $800 million problem in the general fund budget. And I think that's got to get addressed first.
Well, and we've heard it over the years about the structural deficit that gets built into these budgets. This particular case, taking it from 4.25, that would be the state income tax rate currently, to 3.9% was about $1 billion worth of revenue.
Correct.
That's 10% of the general fund.
Right.
And so to make up that kind of money, you talked about $600 million for roads alone, that would completely wipe that out, plus whatever other expenditures. So if you want to make those structural changes, and we don't get into rewriting the entire budget, but what kind of things what are the possible things? What can you do when it comes to sizing down that spending?
Well, where a lot of people go is they say, well, we could go to higher education, we could look at incentive programs such as the MEDC. But even then, you look at it and you say that $600 million plus if you cut the revenue by $1 billion, that's $1.6 billion now. So these are they're difficult problems. It's going to take a lot of work. I think the House Republicans will put forward a budget that does cut some ongoing spending, and that'll be coming out here in the next couple weeks. We'll be seeing the subcommittee budgets through appropriations being reported, and we'll see what that adds up to. The chairman and leadership would have a better idea what the totals are, but I think that's the next step.
Let's talk a little bit about something else you mentioned, and you talked about those retirement bills that are looming out there. And that's a very real thing, and it's all levels of government. Some of it's a county responsibility,
right,
and so on, which you have been involved in. But talk to me about, from a state standpoint, what you can do to address that. The governor certainly has talked a lot about it.
You know, the governor is opposed to closing the MIPSers, the teachers' pension system, because there's a hybrid plan. But really, when you look at it, current teachers are paying for the retirees. In many ways, it's like Social Security. Current wage earners pay for retirees. People are living a lot longer. And some of the underlying assumptions, and the governor took a positive step, I think, this year in the budget, taking the investment return assumption was 8%. We're taking it down to 7.5%. So we've done a little better on our medical, the medical plans in terms of the cost of those has been decreasing a little bit because people are paying a little bit more. This is the retirees. So we're using some of that money to bolster the pension system, at least by reducing that interest rate assumption. When you reduce the interest rate assumption, it means you need to put more money in because you're not going to make as much on your investments. Representative Tom Albert from the 86th District is doing some real good work on the work group. He's the chair of the committee, and I look forward to see what they come up with. But it's a complicated issue. You know, a lot of these things, if they were easy, they'd be solved, as we all know. So the complicated issues are the ones that are hard to address.
And these are ongoing too. So this isn't something that you can just take care of today. I mean, first of all, you don't have the cash to take care of it today.
Right.
Realistically, I guess if you had a big enough checkbook, you could.
Correct.
But you're going to have to deal with it, and it's going to have to be dealt with in an ongoing fashion because every day you have more and more people entering the system.
That's right. And what's interesting though is I think when you look at the teachers, 25% of teachers that have started since the hybrid plan was put in actually have chosen to go into a straight 401k plan. A fact I learned recently when we were talking about this, the schools are asking for, KISD is asking for a local millage here that would go to the schools for operating. When you look at those 21 school districts that are in that district, 8 years ago, they spent 94% of their revenue on salaries and benefits. 8 years ago, the salaries accounted for 63% of that. Today, they account for 55%, and the benefits are the rest. So there's been an 8% shift in spending on teacher salaries. And instead, we're spending a lot more money on benefits. And this, again, is a part of the outgrowth of the costs of these plans. And that, I really believe, is one of the things that's harming the profession in terms of people wanting to go into it, because there's really not a lot of upside on salaries when we continue to have these huge benefit costs, long-term benefit costs that we have to address.
Is that something that you get closer to resolution of this year? I mean, we've had the conversation for a lot of years.
I think it's going to take some time. I think there's interest in the Senate, interest in the House, and I think the governor, despite the fact that he is, publicly opposed to closing the MIPSer system, I think he realizes as a CPA, as I am, that it's an issue that has to be addressed. So, maybe it's some incremental steps that are going to at least make the situation better. But I think that's how things will. And I would expect and hope to see some positive movement on it this year.
We started talking about perhaps a point of contention within the Republican caucus. I know Democrats were opposed to the idea of rolling back the taxes. Some Republicans, such as yourself, voted against that plan. But there is a flip side of that coin, and that is subsequent to that vote, there was a package of bills that dealt with transparency, and I believe all of them passed 108 to nothing. So there is a way to come to an agreement in the State House of Representatives. Talk to me a little bit about those bills and what they would do if the Senate does indeed take them up.
It's interesting. One of the, you get a lot of advocates for these type of bills, but I believe a state that has these laws enacted, state of New York, their governor, Andrew Cuomo, doesn't have a state email account. And that might tell you a little something about how people want to try and do business. And Senator Meekhoff makes some good points. I voted yes on these bills, obviously, since it was 108-0. Because as a local official, I was a township trustee and treasurer. We had to had the FOIA rules apply to us. And so I thought, well, if it's good enough for the locals, it's good enough for the legislature. But I will tell you, the thing I always want to be concerned about, and I think that the bills make provisions for confidentiality with our constituents. But really, Rick, there's not a lot done through email in terms of negotiating. When you start negotiating bills and trying to understand how you're going to get to a conclusion, it doesn't happen on email. It happens face-to-face in many cases, and the discussions I don't think are nefarious. So it's fine. I was supportive of the bills. I don't think they would really change anything to a large degree. But to the extent that you're saying, hey, we're willing to be open, I think that's important to the public.
When you look at the way the legislature works, and I have a different perspective because I've been around it for a long time, and there aren't a whole lot of things that as reporters we don't get to see. We can't go into caucus, for example, which is somewhat understandable, I think. And I'm sure that if we could, you'd simply go somewhere else and talk anyway. So it wouldn't make a great deal of difference. But for the most part, it seems like much of this is accessible, but it almost feels like it's more of an issue of, well, hey, let's put this on the books because it makes it look better if we're willing to let the sun shine in.
As I said, I don't think there would be any grand revelations from people being able to see state emails and communications. I really don't. And so, to the extent that it does spread the sunshine, as it were, I guess it's fine.
Talking about some of the other things you have done. I said this, and you correct me if you're wrong. It seems like it's been a little bit of a slow start this cycle. So as you get ready for a couple of weeks break, I assume that when you get back after Easter, there'll be a lot of things to deal with, including the budget you talked about. But one of the things you have worked on is some criminal justice. We
passed a package of bills that came over from the Senate. I think it's a good start. Last term, I was in favor of raise the age from 17 to 18. I know that means that the prosecutors would still have discretion under certain crimes to charge a 17-year-old as an adult, but right now it's automatic in Michigan. We're one of only 11 states that does that. I'd like to see us back off of that and still give prosecutorial discretion. I mean, that's why you have a prosecutor. And then also what we call presumptive parole, and I think these bills kind of did a little bit on that, more on the fringe. But you just can't keep people locked up forever. And the thing to remember is if we just kept everybody their maximum sentence, then by the time they're out, then the state has you can't have them on probation or parole. And so now they've met their maximum sentence and they're out. So, and I think we are grappling with, the majority of prisoners are in there less than 2 years. And the question is, should they really be in prison or should we be looking at other ways? The other area, and I'll give the Speaker Leonard credit for this, he's really looking at how do we address the fact that we have a lot of mentally ill individuals that are in the prisons? Is that really the place for them? And I think we're trying to do some things there as well.
All right, thanks to Representative Afendoulis and Representative Sabo for talking to us about the first quarter in Lansing. We're back with more To the Point. So as we move into spring, the legislative activity in Lansing is bound to pick up. The budget process will consume a lot of time, but there are still a lot of questions, too, about other initiatives that may be undertaken by Republicans and Democrats. And it's something that we're going to be talking about in depth as we spend time in Lansing and with you here every Sunday morning as we look back at what happened the week before, not just in Lansing, but in Washington, and how it impacts you. You join us 10 o'clock on Wood TV 8 for To the Point.